Hi, welcome to this Farming for the Future video. I'm Danny O'Brien and I'm coming to you from the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngamberi people. The purpose of this video is to provide some background and context for you as you review your farm scale natural capital account report that's been delivered as part of the Farming for the Future program. I'm not going to go through everything in detail, but rather pick out some of the key elements for discussion and provide some more context that's not contained within the report itself. I hope you find this useful. I'm going to use one of our participant farm reports as an example as we walk through the key elements. I'd like to thank Michael and Millie Taylor of Taylor's Run for allowing us to use their report for this purpose. What you can see on the screen is a table of contents of the farm report on the left with the content displayed for the report on the right. I'm going to keep to this format as we go through the video so that you can see which section of the report is relating to the content you're seeing. The currently active section will be highlighted in blue in the table of contents, including a red arrow to point it out. We've created chapters in this video to make it easier for you to jump to a particular topic while reviewing your farm report. I'd like to recommend that you watch the introduction, context and overview sections prior to viewing any of the detailed chapters of the report, as there's important context provided there. The method for navigating chapters will depend on the device that you're using. When watching this video in a browser on a computer, the chapter details and links appear in the video description below the video. If you're viewing the video in a YouTube app on an iPad, you can access the chapters simply by tapping on the screen to bring up the current chapter, and then click on the chapter name to bring up a list of all of the chapters. When viewing this video on a phone, you can access the chapters in two different ways. If using a browser on the phone, simply click on the More hyperlink below the video to see the chapter list. If you're using the YouTube app, then click on the small drop-down button on the right below the video to see the chapter list. Before we get into the detail of the report itself, I just wanted to provide some context about where your natural capital account report fits into the overall Farming for the Future program. So the primary goal of Farming for the Future is to build an understanding of the relationship between natural capital and farm business performance. Traditionally, it's been considered that increasing natural capital comes at a trade-off to farm business performance, and yet small early studies would indicate that this isn't necessarily the case, and there's certainly the potential for a trade-on zone where increasing natural capital also provides improved farm business performance. So Farming for the Future's goal is to do that econometric analysis to be able to tease out whether this is indeed the case. In order to do that, we need to be able to quantify the type, condition and configuration of natural capital on a farm so that we can feed that into the benchmarking process. You'd be familiar with financial accounting, and in financial accounts, they tell you what you owe and what you own at a point in time. You're typically looking at annual periods, and then the transactions underneath those accounts tell you how you got from point A to point B. What financial accounting misses is the health of the natural capital that underpins that farm business performance. And that's where these accounts, the natural capital accounts, come in. The natural capital accounts are providing an objective or factual representation at a point in time of the natural capital that is underpinning that farm business performance. We're intending that this information would be used by farmers to be able to not only track their performance against expectation of the natural capital based on their previous management decisions, but also use it to guide future management decisions. Now, whilst financial accounts are collated annually, we wouldn't expect to do that for farm scale natural capital accounts because the natural capital underpinning the production system doesn't change that rapidly. We would envisage that you would reassess natural capital every 5 years or so. The key thing here is that for Farming for the Future, we're only doing that first point in time. And so the information in your natural capital account can be considered a baseline for that natural capital. So in order to understand what natural capital exists on a farm, we've used a combination of methods to be able to assess this. We've used spatial analytics, so remote sensing, to be able to initially characterize the various zones on the farm. We've used farmer information that's been provided at paddock scale, and then we've used ecological assessments, which are on-ground assessments. The reality is that we haven't been able to go and visit every point on a farm. And so what you're seeing in your report is that there'll be in Appendix 2, there's an indication of all of the points that we visited on your farm. Once we've assessed that point using that rapid ecological assessment, we'll use the information there to then impute a condition to another point that we've considered to be similar. There's also a table in Appendix 2 that provides that mapping of where we visited and then which paddocks we used to impute that value to. When we consider the types of natural capital that we're including in the farm assessment, we include everything ranging from remnant vegetation, which will be forests and woodlands, pastures, crops, soil, water, and the animals on the farm. These all contribute to farm production and so must be considered in scope for inclusion in the accounts. The challenge that this creates is that the natural capital comes in all shapes, sizes, and configurations across different farms. As this is a research program, we didn't want to presuppose which elements of the natural capital would have the tightest relationship with farm production. And so we've worked to investigate a range of measures that reflect the different types of natural capital that might be on a farm. In this phase of the research project, we've identified 7 indices that we think capture the variety of natural capital across a farm. There's a few important points that I'd like to make about these indices before we get into the detail. Firstly, the index score is just a numeric representation of the spatial variation that we found on your farm for that particular element of natural capital. Your farm reports provide maps and tables that expose that spatial variation, and we're hoping that this information is useful in your decision-making process. Secondly, whilst the indices are scaled from 0 to 1, it doesn't necessarily follow that every index we would target 1 as an optimal outcome. An example of this is proximity, where if you had a score of 1, you would have wall-to-wall trees on your farm and you would have very little pasture systems sitting under that. And so that would be a very poor outcome from a productivity perspective. So I guess the important thing to understand here is that the target ranges for each of the indices is going to depend on the type of natural capital element that is representing, but also your personal goals and management ethos on your farm. Thirdly, these indices have been generated so that you can track change over time on your farm. And whilst they can be used to compare farms across a particular index, our primary goal here is to be able to provide you with information so that you can track change over time with respect to these natural capital elements, and that can feed into your decision-making processes. Having said that, given that all of this is so new, it's important to have some context so that you can understand what a particular index value means and the relevance for you when feeding that into your decision-making process. To provide that context, we've mapped out the index variability across all of the farms in our farm sample. On the left here, you can see the box plots showing the spread of values for each of the indices. And the way to interpret these is that for a given index, the blue boxes represent 50% of the samples, while these lines above and below those boxes represent the bulk of the remainder of the sample. These little dots represent outliers that are beyond the typical range of the samples. So what you can see here is that particular scores vary across the different indices, and the ranges of those values for the different farms vary across these different indices. In addition to the box plots for all farms, we've broken it down, those box plots down by rainfall clusters as well. So less than 600 millimetres, 600 to 750 millimetres, and greater than 750 millimetres. Each index has a box plot for each of those clusters. And again, the dark colours, the boxes represent the 50% of samples. The little lines represent the bulk of the samples. And then we've got those outliers. The intent of these box plots is not to say what is good or bad, but just rather to provide a little bit of extra context when you're looking at the indices for your farm. You won't find these box plots in your individual farm reports. So what we're going to do is we're still working on defining the clusters more cleanly, and then we'll provide a document that provides this analysis so that you can use that in conjunction with your farm report. For the purposes of this video, I have included the individual box plots for each of the indices when we're looking at the index score in the example. In addition to the natural capital indices and their detail, we've also taken the opportunity to include estimates of greenhouse gas emissions and sequestration on your farm. We've done this because more and more farmers are being asked to report or get visibility of their greenhouse gas emissions. And so given that we had the production information that allows us to calculate that, we've taken this opportunity. All of our emissions calculations are using the methodologies defined in the Greenhouse Gas National Inventory for Australia. So the bar chart you're seeing here is a summary of the emission sources for your farm, the sequestration on your farm, and then a couple of net balance positions. Scope 1 emissions, the blue bar, are representing emissions that are occurring on your farm. So that includes enteric emissions from livestock, emissions from the manure. It also includes emissions from fertilisers that have been applied onto your pastures and crops, and then the consumption or use of fossil fuels on farm. Scope 2 emissions are related to the electricity consumed on farm for the purposes of livestock and cropping enterprises, and those emissions relate to the actual production of the electricity in the first place. Scope 3 emissions represent emissions that have occurred off farm, so prior to your farm, and these are effectively embedded emissions in the products that you purchase. Now, that includes livestock that you may have purchased, so the emissions associated with rearing those livestock to the point that you've purchased them. It also includes emissions associated with the production of fertilisers and other inputs, as well as the production and transport of fossil fuels to your farm. The green bar is the estimated sequestration in the woody vegetation on your farm. We've used a tool called Flint Pro, which allows us to model a combination of any plantings that you've undertaken on your farm, but also the sequestration within the woody vegetation across the broader farm enterprise. We've not included soil carbon in these sequestration estimates, not because we didn't want to, but because we felt that the methodologies don't exist to be able to provide a cost-effective and scalable solution without having to do detailed soil samples and lab analysis. Whilst the cost and effort of measuring soil carbon may be appropriate when running a soil carbon project, the cost was prohibitive in the context of compiling natural capital accounts. So this is an area for development in the future. The last two bars on the chart are representing two different versions of your net position for greenhouse gas emissions. The one on the right is showing your net position ignoring the Scope 3 emissions. And the reason that we're presenting this is if you're considering the emissions associated with the farm enterprise itself and what happens on your farm, we can ignore the existence of those pre-farm emissions. So here it's looking at the emissions occurring from the start of when something comes onto your farm to when something leaves your farm. The flip side of that is the net position including Scope 3. And the reason that we've presented that as well is that if you're considering when you're presenting greenhouse gas emissions to a supply chain, for example, you need to be able to consider all of the emissions that have gone into producing your product, which includes the embedded emissions in the products that you've purchased that have then enabled you to undertake your operations. So we're providing both of these so that you can use them as required. So let's have a look at the detail of the indices in your report. The first index that you'll find is the Forage Condition Index. What we've done here is we've used the ecological assessments in the field to be able to classify each area of grazing into one of four classes, A, B, C, and D, based on the perenniality, palatability, persistence, and productive capacity of each of the species that we saw in those swards. We're also looking at the density of each of those species in the sward. The challenge with a classification like this is that it could be seen as being judgmental in terms of A being better than B, better than C, and better than D, but our intent is not to do that. Our intent is just to use these classifications to describe the structural characteristics of the sward that we identified in the field. The way we did that was to leverage a methodology used by the Queensland government in their LCAT tool to be able to look at each of the species that we would see in the sward and their density, and then combine those results into a score that we can then assign to a classification. So what happened when the ecologists went out into the field? They went to the point in the ecosystem unit that they were assessing. They would look at the species by biomass there, and they would pick out the top 5 species and those species, the density of each of those species, and record that point. Would then go to another point in the paddock and then a third point. If all of those are quite similar, then that was as much information as we collected. If there was high variability in each of those points, the ecologists then went on to another 2 points to be able to get the variability across the sward. So each of the species that we've seen then gets assigned a classification based on its perenniality, palatability, persistence, and production for forage capacity. Each of the species assigned a classification in terms of their perenniality, palatability, persistence, and productive capacity. So if a species meets all of those characteristics, then it will be classified as a 3P species. A species that might be perennial and palatable, but not necessarily that productive because it produces less biomass, would be classified as a 2P species. And then something that might be perennial, but not that palatable or productive would be given a 1P classification. We've also got classifications for gap filler perennials, valuable annuals, and annuals. So we're differentiating those high biomass, high production capacity annuals from other annuals in the system. So in classifying those and looking at the density, we then come up with a score or a number that combines all of the species that we saw at a point in the sward. And then we use that score to be able to assign it to the classification. So as I said, we're not intending for this classification to be judgmental in any way. And in fact, depending on your management philosophy for your landscape, if you believe that your best production outcomes are based on annual pastures with maybe a few perennials through it, then you would be aiming for a classification in C and maybe D class pastures because that fits your management paradigm. Whereas if you feel that your productive outcomes are going to be achieved through a highly diverse and dense perennial pasture, then you would be looking for classifications in A and B classification. We also provide a map that represents those classifications. So remembering that we visited some points and then we've imputed the condition to other points based on the information that you provided and also the spatial information. And the greyed out areas are areas that are either infrastructure areas or areas for cereal cropping that we haven't provided a grazing classification, even if they might be used for grazing of stubbles. And then that information is also consolidated into a tabular form based on the ecosystem state, and we'll get into that a little bit later, but looking at the different classifications and number of hectares across each of those classes of ecosystem type. So then the grazing condition score is just an area weighted summary of the individual scores by area. The next index that I'd like to look at is soil condition. We've used ground cover as a proxy for soil condition in this phase of the project because we weren't able to come up with a soil sampling regime that was scalable and cost effective for the purposes of compiling natural capital accounts. In reality, what we'd like this soil condition metric to represent is the long-term health of the soil in order of its capacity to be able to continue to produce food and fibre over time. One of the interesting anecdotes that I use is when we were originally talking to soil scientists around this measure, one of the scientists indicated over in the West there were cases where a landscape had been cropped and cropped and cropped and cropped until it was only good for sandalwood plantations. So what we'd like to do is have this measure being an indicator that we're picking up those leading indicators telling us whether we're heading towards a sandalwood plantation scenario or whether we're maintaining the capacity of the landscape to be able to continue to produce food and fibre, or indeed if we're moving away from it. So we're not intending this soil measure to be a short-term agronomic measure, but more picking up that long-term trajectory. So using ground cover as a proxy, we've looked at 5 years of satellite imagery at a 30 metre by 30 metre pixel on the farm. And then we've looked at the values for each of those pixels, looked at the minimum ground cover or the 10th percentile ground cover each year, the average ground cover, and then we've looked at the maximum ground cover to be able to determine the variability from that maximum to the minimum for a given year. So we do that for every pixel across the farm for every year, and then we've done a 5-year average of those values across the farm. We then combine those 3 metrics into a single number, and then so you'll see that plotted on the screen here. So the darker the colour means that we've got higher minimum ground cover combined with higher average ground cover, and then also lower variability. So we're inverting the variability value so that the darker the colour indicates a less variable ground cover metric. So you can see a couple of spots here are lighter patches, and so they will be indicating that either they had a lower minimum ground cover or a lower mean ground cover, and possibly even higher variability of the ground cover as well. I'd also draw your attention to Appendix 4, which provides some additional information relating to ground cover. So what we've done here is we've plotted out your rainfall, and we've used some Bureau of Meteorology models to be able to estimate the rainfall as an average across your landscape. Then plotting that on a monthly basis, but also an annual basis in this blue line. And then we've plotted your minimum ground cover in the light grey line, and then the mean ground cover by year in the darker line. We've also looked at the proportion of the landscape that stayed above 70% ground cover. So we're using 70% as a threshold by which we're considering that you're protecting your landscape from wind and water erosion. So you can see in this case with the farm that minimum ground cover does dip in the drier periods, but then it manages to track back up such that they're maintaining the minimum ground cover above 70% on most of their farm across the latter years. In addition to the rainfall analytics, we've also provided maps showing you the average minimum ground cover across the 5 years for each of the pixels on the farm, as well as the average ground cover, and then also variability. And we're hoping this level of detail helps you tease out what's happening in your landscape in terms of the outcomes from your management decisions. So the next 4 indices that we're going to look at relate to the woody vegetation on the farm and different structural characteristics of that woody vegetation. The first of these is proximity. Proximity is really the measure of the distance from woody vegetation to production areas. So in the case where we've got a tree within a grazing paddock, that point there would be scored as 1, and then the further we move away from the woody vegetation, the lower the score. And then your proximity measure is just an overall average across the whole of the farm. So the table at the bottom of the page here is showing that a score of 0.5 for this index indicates that on average, each production area or pixel is 20 metres from a tree. And you can see on the right here with the box plots that most of the farms would indeed fit between this 0.2 to 0.5 range with a few outliers. We've also provided a map that shows you the configuration. You'll see here that some areas are in grey, and those are non-production areas where they're either conservation zones or they're infrastructure areas. The trees in those zones do still have an impact on the score because the production areas beside or adjacent to those trees will include the existence of those trees, but we're not calculating the score inside those non-production areas as either. And then the score that we saw on the previous screen is just an average of all of these points across the farm. The next woody vegetation index is connectivity, and connectivity is relating to the connectedness of the woody vegetation on the farm to be able to provide stepping stones or connected corridors for animals in the landscape. So typically birds, but also other animals in the landscape. To a degree, this is a biodiversity measure, but we're also considering that there are also benefits from a production perspective in providing that connected habitat, because you may then get other ecosystem services from those animals in terms of fertilisation or pollination or pest suppression. So a high score here means that there's high levels of connectivity across the farm, whereas a lower score means that that vegetation may be a bit more disparate and less clustered. the map is showing the level of connectivity for that woody vegetation, and so the darker the score, the more connected it is. Now, I should note that we haven't been able to do these calculations for connectivity for all of our farms because we only have models for New South Wales and Victoria. We are working to see if we can get models for Tasmania and Western Australia, but at the moment those weren't available. The third index from a woody vegetation perspective is aggregation. So aggregation is almost the inverse of the proximity measure because it's looking at how aggregated the woody vegetation is on the farm. So if we look at the graphic itself, this is really showing that we've got vegetation that is spread out across the farm, and certainly there are clumps of dense vegetation, but on the whole it is distributed across the farm. And so in this case, Taylor's Run would score a relatively low score for aggregation. Now, aggregation is important from a biodiversity perspective because you need clusters or groupings of woody vegetation of a certain size in order to be able to provide viable habitat for animals. And so this measure is really more related to the biodiversity outcomes of the farm in the ability to provide that. So a farm that might score very high on the aggregation index is probably one that has large areas of remnant vegetation that is set aside for conservation purposes, and then the rest of the production area probably has limited woody vegetation spread throughout that landscape. And while we're on this graphic, I'll also point out that for the farms that had a riparian zone, we've drawn that in blue on this map. So a riparian zone is classified as a major stream or a minor stream that is named. We haven't mapped out every single drainage line or gully on the landscape because it was getting too complex, but we've picked out those minor named streams and also the major streams. We then buffer from the middle of that stream out by 30 metres or 50 metres, depending on whether it's a minor or a major stream. And then the aquatic condition metric is looking at the canopy cover inside that riparian zone. So this aquatic condition measure is not a measure of water quality coming off the farm, but rather of the structural configuration of the riparian zones on the farm that then help to manage the water quality leaving the farm that going into those riparian zones. At the moment, we've only used tree cover to be able to calculate this aquatic condition. And over time, what we'd like to do is adapt this measure to be able to include ground cover as well, because we know that that has a high degree of relevance in terms of the ability of that landscape to be able to provide water filtration and protection services. So that's something that we will be developing in future phases of the project. That brings us to our final natural capital indicator, which is ecological condition. This is really the crux of the natural capital account because the ecological condition index is a summary of all of the ecological assets on the farm. To be able to do that, we've used a method called a state and transition model, which is really just the ability to classify each point or unit on the farm against a particular ecosystem type and state, so that we can say at this point in time, this is what we saw. We've created 4 state and transition models for the different types of major ecosystems that we've seen in the landscape, that being woodlands, forests, grasslands and shrublands. The model we're looking at here is our woodland state and transition model. The way to read this is in the top left-hand corner, we have a condition or a state that represents a reference woodland, or which is pretty much the best on offer landscape in terms of woodland classification. In that state, something in that state would have high canopy cover, it would have lots of regeneration with multiple age cohorts over time, it would have a very diverse and native ground layer with very little introduced species in that landscape. Moving from a reference woodland into a transitioning woodland, we would see that when we maybe have less regeneration in the canopy layer, and then also we're starting to see the introduction of exotic species in the ground layer. And then we've got 4 different states just representing the different degrees of modification all the way through to a largely exotic ground layer. Those 4 transitioning woodland states still have canopy above 5%. If we were to lose the canopy through clearing or through other events, then we would move to a derived grassland state. And in those states, again, we have these different sequences. So a derived grassland 1 would still have a high level of native diversity in that ground layer, but it's just missing the canopy cover. Then through to derived grassland 4, which is where we've got what is still probably a perennial naturalised pasture, but it's got a larger number or predominantly exotic species in that ground layer. Derived grassland 5 and 6 represent highly modified sown pastures, a 5 representing perennial, and then 6 representing annual pastures. You can also see down the bottom, we've got a number of states to handle the highly modified landscapes in a cropping zone, where we're looking at cropping with scattered trees, cropping without scattered trees, and then irrigated cropping. We also have some states for grasslands whereby we're accounting for irrigation in those landscapes. The other states that we're seeing in here allow for other modification regimes in terms of planting of trees. The plant native trees, we're looking at different age cohorts there, but then we've also got exotic woody vegetation where there would be planting of exotic trees and then shrubs and also perennial horticulture. So we think we've captured the balance of providing a model that allows us to classify what we see at a point in time at a level of detail that you can detect change over time, but it's not so detailed that we turn ourselves inside out trying to decide which point to assign to which state. The outcome of this is that each of the ecosystem units that we visited, we use that ecological information that we collected in the field work for the canopy layer, the shrub layer, and the ground layer, and we use that to assign each of those points to an ecosystem state. And you can see the representation here shows a diversity of those different ecosystem types and states across the landscape. We've also provided this information in tabular form so that you can see a little bit more detail about the different classes or ecosystem states that have been assigned on the farm, and then the extent or number of hectares that meet each of those classifications. You'll also see in this table that we've assigned each type or class an ecological condition weighting, and this ecological condition weighting is effectively its measure of nativeness, and we've done this so that we can then calculate an overall score for the farm. I just want to emphasise that whilst this weighting is reflecting its nativeness, we're not trying to infer any judgment on whether one state is better than another. We just wanted to be able to use those weightings to be able to calculate an overall score so that you can then track change over time. And then you can see here that we've then taken the area weighted average of those ecological condition scores and then created an ecological condition measure, so the index itself. Again, the intent here is not to say that that's good or bad, but it's just being able to say this is a summary of the ecological condition at a point in time across the whole farm, and then we can track that change over time. So the final section that I'd like to take you through is a little bit about the detail of the emissions and sequestration. So if you have a look at the detailed section for greenhouse gas emissions, you'll see that we've provided this bar chart with a little bit more detail. And so we've taken the scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions and broken them down by the different sources across both the livestock enterprise and the cropping enterprise. The important thing to understand here is if you are producing a crop but then feeding all of that across to the livestock, then we would have calculated the emissions associated with the production process of that crop, but we'll allocate it to the livestock enterprise. So in that case, you would see if it was fertiliser, you would see the fertiliser appearing as livestock fertiliser rather than cropping fertiliser. So in the case where you are seeing emissions associated with crops, it's because you've actually sold those crops as products coming off your farm. We've also provided it in tabular form. So again, you can see the different scopes. So on farm being scope 1 and 2 sources, and then off farm being scope 3 emission source. And we've broken that down again by the livestock production and then the crop production. The other interesting thing to look at here is that we've discriminated between emissions that are coming from a geospheric source versus a biospheric source. So a geospheric source are emissions that have come from fossil fuels, and those emissions, that is carbon that's come out of the atmosphere millions of years ago to be sequestered as fossil fuel, and then that's been extracted and then emitted back into the landscape and into the atmosphere. We've differentiated that from biospheric source because biospheric carbon is something that's working on a lot shorter time cycle. So it's carbon that's been pulled out of the atmosphere into plants in very recent. That's then being eaten by the animals and then emitted back into the landscape. Or it might be carbon that's cycled into manure and then turned into fertilizer and then applied, and then again that goes into the atmosphere. So the reason that we've separated these out is because they have very different implications from a global warming perspective, and we wanted to be able to provide the level of detail in here so that you can understand the implications of the management practices that you're implementing on your farm. You can see in this case, this farm is not doing any cropping, so all of those numbers are zero. But if you've got a cropping enterprise, you'll see some values there. The other things to understand here is that the pre-farm emissions, they can vary depending on the type of operation you run. So, and where you've got a self-replacing flock or herd in your livestock enterprise, most of your emissions will be in the enteric and urine scope, whereas if you're doing a lot of trading, purchasing animals, fattening them and then selling them, then quite a few of your emissions are going to be falling into this scope 3 perspective. And then, as we've previously discussed, we've also estimated the carbon sequestered and provided those two carbon balances. So looking a little bit more detail into that carbon sequestration process, as I mentioned, we've used a tool called Flint Pro to model the woody vegetation on the landscape, both planted and natural. And then it's broken down by a number of different pools of carbon. So above ground, the blue is the biomass sitting above the ground. The green is below ground in the roots, and then the orange is the dead organic matter, so branches and things that have fallen to the ground and leaf litter, and that dead organic matter will be decomposing over time and then moving into the atmosphere and also into the soil. In this case, we have some harvested wood in use as well. This farm actually has some forestry operations whereby we're harvesting some of that timber, which will be seen as a loss, but then that timber is moved into furniture products and other woody materials that then are considered sequestered for a period of time. The important line is the purple line, this top line in this case, because this is showing the amount of carbon that's been taken out of the atmosphere and stored in these other pools. So this purple line is just a sum of the lines. And so you can see with this farm that it's modelled to be sequestering carbon, increasing over time, and then it's projected to continue to increase that sequestration. Now, that sequestration rate will slow down over time once that woody vegetation in the landscape becomes more mature, and so it won't grow as rapidly. If you're interested in a little bit more detail about how we've done this sequestration calculation, there's some more information at the end of your report under the modelling of carbon stocks. So the final component that I'd like to draw your attention to are the resource use intensities tables. So in addition to the total greenhouse gas emissions produced on farm for all of the enterprises combined, what we've done is we've taken that information and then split it by the products coming off the farm so that you can see the resource intensity in terms of those products produced. So we've done this for wool and sheep live weight. So we take the emissions associated with the overall sheep enterprise and split them on a biophysical allocation across the wool product and the sheep live weight product. For cattle enterprise, we're assigning it against cattle live weight, and then for a cropping enterprise, we're assigning those emissions against total tonnage of crop produced. We're providing a number of different metrics. So we're looking at water pollution generated, greenhouse gas emissions per kilo of product output, waste, water use, and then also nitrogen, lime, and phosphorus use. Each of these tables represents the value, so the emissions or water pollution per kilo of product over a 5-year average. And we use a 5-year average just to be able to take out some of the noise, because some of these numbers can move dramatically depending on the timing of some of the management activities, whether you're purchasing or selling livestock, or when you're shearing and selling wool. So that average just smooths that out a little bit so that we get a more meaningful long-term view. Where possible, we've provided benchmarks, because the first thing that people ask is, well, what does that number mean? Is it good or bad? And so we've tried to dig out some benchmarks that help provide a little bit of context around the results for your farm. So for wool, sheep live weight and cattle live weight, we've sourced some benchmarks from Australia, and that's really based on 3 different rainfall zones, so high, medium and low rainfall zones. Those benchmarks are really focused at self-replacing herds or flocks, and so if you're trading, your performance will be a little bit different to those benchmarks, but at least it still gives you a little bit of context there. The Kering benchmark comes from Kering, who are a multinational, multi-billion-dollar operation, and they own a number of the high-end fashion brands. For example, Stella McCartney, they used to own Puma. They've created a thing called their environmental profit and loss, where they actually try to put a monetary value on the impacts that their operations have on the environment. And so what we've done is we've been out, given they're a large wool consumer, they've got a benchmark for wool coming from farm. And so we've been able to compare against that benchmark. We haven't been able to provide benchmarks for all of the products. For example, crops, they're just so dynamic in terms of regionality and also crop type that we haven't been able to find a really good way that we're comfortable producing those benchmarks for crops at the moment. So I would suggest that you just look for a locally appropriate benchmark that you can find, just to be able to gauge your the performance of your indicators against that. In this table, we're looking at a number of indicators. So water pollution is really looking at the nitrogen runoff from fertilizers and manures into the river systems. Greenhouse gas emissions is just a split of those greenhouse gases that we calculated earlier. Waste is associated with the packaging on products that you may have bought as inputs to the farm. And then water use is looking at the water consumed by the livestock, but also embedded in the fodder. And that's of particular relevance when we're talking about irrigated pastures, because all of that water use will then be fed through into the livestock enterprise as water per kilo of output. We've considered the relative availability of water in here. So the water use metric is looking at the absolute water use per kilo of output, but then we've got a normalized stress weighted water consumption, and this is really looking at the relative availability of water in the landscape that water is being consumed versus the worldwide average. So in this case, you can see that our water use drops from 42 litres per kilo of wool down to 1.31 litres per kilo of wool, and really that's just telling me that this farm is in a landscape that's got high availability of water, and therefore the water consumption isn't creating a challenge. If you are in a landscape, for example, the Murray-Darling Basin or some other areas which have relatively low water availability, you'll see that the number increases from the absolute value to the stress-weighted water value, and that's just saying that that water is being consumed in a landscape that is water stressed. And then our last 3 indicators here are providing just the nitrogen use efficiency, lime use efficiency and phosphorus use efficiency per kilo of product. So this is not looking at the net balance of nitrogen in and out, it's just looking at the nitrogen applied per kilo of product output. So those are the main elements that I'd like to take you through in the report. I would also draw your attention to Appendix 6, and this is really just providing a mapping of each of those indices or indicators that we've talked through, and the sorts of ecosystem services that we would expect to see those driving. This is really to give you a little bit of the so what. So why is proximity important or connectivity important? And so this table is not specific to your farm, but more generic, saying that these indicators are really reflective of different types of ecosystem services and functions in the landscape. So the next steps from here, we'd love to get your feedback with respect to the reports. So please provide feedback via your advisor. We'd love to know if you found any issues with the mapping in terms of the ecosystem assignments or forage condition assignments, because we've done our best that we can with the ecological assessments that we've been able to do on the farm and the information we have, but there's always a possibility that we haven't got it quite right. So we'd be more than happy to take your feedback there. We'd also, given that this is a research project, we want to know how useful this is. And what is useful and what isn't in the report and what's missing. So we'd love to get that feedback via your advisor. So this is your natural capital account report. As I said at the outset, we're continuing to do the compilation of all of the econometrics analysis to give us that benchmarking analysis output. We're just trying to finalise it at the moment. And then once we've done that, you'll get an individual benchmarking report that will go through in the similar approach for each of you across your farm. And then we'll also be packaging up some additional materials such as maps, ecological data and other information and supply them to you in a digital format so that you can leverage and extend them over time. That brings us to the end of this video. I hope it's been useful in helping you understand the context around the farm scale natural capital account report that's feeding into the benchmarking analysis. We'll be looking to produce more videos about different aspects. So if you have a particular aspect of the report or of the overall program that you'd like us to dig into a little bit more, please feel free to provide some suggestions and we'll see if we can come up with some videos for those aspects in the future. Thank you very much for your time.